Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 15 lecture. So let's wrap up Blake very quickly. I just have a couple of final points that I wanted to make, but I ran out of time back in part 1. So we'll do that quickly. Then we'll spend some time on circumstance, which is a personal favorite of mine. I hope we enjoy it. It's our final required text of the semester, so we don't have a whole lot of time for it, but I would like to devote at least maybe 15, 20 minutes because it's a really interesting story and it has a lot to say. And then finally, I'll conclude by just talking a little bit about the final exam. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it. I just want to maybe put some of your fears at rest, to rest, I think is the expression, and just talk a little bit about the study guide that I've already posted and just kind of what to expect and also how we're going to take it. Okay, so let's just wrap up with Blake here. So we were talking previously a little bit about repetitions and structure. We talked about how we can notice some pretty clear repetitions between part 2 and part 1. And I know sometimes the repetitive nature of the book might strike us as simply bad writing, and maybe it is, you can make that case, but it's also a rhetorical device. And I think that's largely why Delaney's doing it. So again, we need to make sure that we understand why Delaney is making certain artistic or rhetorical choices. And again, here, I think we see repetition for a lot of reasons. It's helping him to make his argument in a lot of different ways. So we can notice a lot of those. I think you guys should definitely look for repetitions and think about the repetitions that are on display throughout part 2. Throughout the later chapters, we see a lot of certain types of scenes are often repeated, seclusions are held, plans are made, but a lot of things, a lot of the setups, a lot of the actions depicted are repeated, or at least they seem very similar to things that we've previously seen. And again, that's deliberate, right? It's intentional. We don't have to think it works very well, but we need to think about the rhetorical reasons behind some of these repetitions. Why is Delaney using them? And a couple that I just find personally interesting, I hope at least some of us might agree, but just something that he does multiple times that's kind of weird. And again, when I argue that he actually is kind of innovative, in certain ways, this is kind of what I mean. So if you guys go back to the section that I was talking about in part 1, between chapters 44 and 54, we have yet another journey here as Henry is out at sea. Remember, they have attempted to take over a slaving vessel so they can use it in their insurrection. They eventually abandon that plan, or we might say that God's providence stepped in to prevent that potentially ill-conceived rebellion from happening. They sort of adopt a different course of action. But there's this one moment, this one scene. This is in chapter 47, I believe on page 212, if you have my edition. And we should pay attention to the footnote here. But this is weird, and Delaney does this a couple of times, so we should sort of account for it. We get this song on page 212, On Board the Vessel. This song is sung by an African-American character named Gaskar. But if you look at the footnote, according to Delaney, and these are Delaney's original footnotes, we actually realize that this apparently is based, this scene is based on a real event, but Delaney is changing certain important details about the event. He says in the footnote, this song was sung by a little black boy sitting by himself on a fence in the South, musing. So it sounds like Delaney witnessed this, like he is somehow aware of this event occurring in reality. So then he uses that event and kind of reimagines it in a fictional form. So he takes the song, he takes the action performed and he gives it to a different character occupying a different space. So he changes the location, he kind of changes the context a little bit, but the song apparently is the same song that he heard this young African American child in the South sing. So why is he doing this? I think there are a couple of different possible reasons, and some of you even touched on this on the discussion board. We mentioned that he might be using a lot of these repetitions between the U.S. and Cuba, different slaveries, different slave societies. He might be doing some of that to show us that because slavery exists in various forms, in various parts of the Americas, and because slaves can be found in all of these different places, that means that insurrection can occur in all of these different places. And what if different groups can actually align and come into league with one another? So again, it almost kind of seems like Henry has abandoned a lot of his early plans when he was traveling in the South. It seems like they've adopted Cuba as a place that has conditions that are more favorable to an insurrection. And of course, he's also there to find his wife, but he sort of accomplishes that early in part 2. So like I said last time, we have another hero's journey. We have a bunch of hero's journeys throughout the entire novel. That's another example of repetition. So we see the world as it is when he's in Cuba, and then he sort of embarks on various adventures. But after sort of reconnecting with his wife and reconnecting with his long-lost cousin Placido, this real-life Cuban poet and advocate for emancipation, because slavery lasted in Cuba even longer, if you can believe it, than it did in the U.S. So Placido's a real person, a poet, an important figure in Cuban history that we know very little about in the U.S. So again, is it a really well-drawn character? Maybe not, but it's just interesting what Delaney's doing in part 2 by importing real historical figures. And in the case of what we see in Cuba, also importing a real-life slave insurrection. I believe it's La Escalera, or translates to the ladder, is a real slave insurrection planned in Cuba. I believe, let me see my dates here, 1843 to 1844. So that's the model for the insurrection that Blake and his associates are planning throughout part 2. So I know the plot feels tortured and improbable at times, and it is, but it is important, like I said in part 1, to remember that he's basing a lot of the details, a lot of the plot points on real historical events, but he often slightly fictionalizes them. So another example of him doing that involves Placido, and this is in chapter 74, pages 307, pages 307 and 308 in my edition. So here we see Placido attacked and sort of beaten in the street by a white man, and we get once again a footnote written by Delaney informing us. If we turn here, let's just turn to 307. Should have already marked it. A similar circumstance really transpired in Wheeling, Virginia, between a white man called a gentleman and a black man. So once again, Delaney's taking an event that was apparently witnessed by him, a real life event, and then he's fictionalizing it. He's not changing the nature or the real material of the event, but he's changing the location of the event, of the event, and he's putting it into the realm of a different character under, slightly different circumstances. But again, we have a lot of reason to believe that Delaney is drawing on his own experiences here. I think I mentioned when I was first introducing the novel that Delaney was born in what is now West Virginia. But originally it was just part of regular Virginia. So Wheeling, the city mentioned in that footnote, that's in West Virginia now. But at the time of Delaney's birth, I think it was still just Virginia. So that's how he refers to it. In fact, I believe West Virginia broke off from Virginia not long. I don't remember all my U.S. history, but it happened largely as a result of slavery. With the Civil War kind of brewing, West Virginia wanted to remain kind of a non-slave space. So they eventually split from Virginia, which went on to, of course, become a part of the Confederacy and was obviously a huge slaveholding state. So this sounds like something that Delaney himself would have witnessed. This is very much the part of the world where he comes from. So he's taking it, but he's moving it from Virginia to Cuba, and he's making it happen to Placido, this real person. So it's a rather strange move in a lot of ways. And like I said in part one, it's not that Delaney's the first author to ever combine fact and fiction. He's not the first author, to kind of blend or interweave history with, fiction. But what he is doing that's kind of novel is he's taking real life, kind of important characters within African American societies, and he's using them, and he's using these details and these facts from a kind of a history that's almost separate in some ways, or a history that was almost kind of cut off from or isolated from the U.S. mainstream at the time. Again, we could argue that it's not so separate now. I think some people might say it is still rather separate, and others would say, no, we deal with it now, we talk about it now, we're willing to do a lot more, certainly than we were willing to do back in the 19th century. But certainly at this time, 1850s, early 1860s, this African American history, and a figure like Placido, who would have been well known to African Americans in Cuba, and probably a lot of other Cubans too, just because of his outsized role, but wouldn't have been very familiar to U.S. readers in a lot of cases. So again, Delaney's drawing on sort of a unique history because it's more of an African American history that, at least at this point, wasn't as widely known as kind of the dominant historical narratives that were already in circulation about America, about the Americas. So yeah, you guys are right to think that his repetitions are helping us to see that the Americas are all kind of united. They all share certain commonalities. And we've already mentioned that a little bit, even going back to Cabeza de Vaca. We were sort of saying, the colonial histories of the different parts of the Americas are different, right? The colonial history of Mexico is different than the colonial history of the U.S. We have different colonial histories in the Caribbean based on what European country colonized those places and how slavery functioned in those places. But if we are looking at commonalities, if we are looking at things that all different parts of the Americas do sort of share, it's often conflict and extermination of Native Americans, and in many cases, most parts of the America had at least some kind of experience with slavery, usually for a very extended period of time, whether it's British America, Spanish America, or French America. Slavery was a common factor that united all of those disparate parts of the New World. So yeah, I do think Delaney wants us to understand that, but there's even a larger purpose as well, larger message, which is this means that insurrection can really take place anywhere within the Americas, anywhere within a slave society where a lot of these injustices persist and a lot of these social conditions exist. But again, we see with our travels in the South that not all slave societies are the same. And there are different social conditions that might make insurrections more possible or more likely in some places versus others. So Delaney also wants us to see that. Again, there's kind of an anthropological function here. He's doing a little bit of ethnography, we might say, sort of taking stock and creating a catalog of different slave societies, how they work, their similarities, and their differences. So yeah, that's pretty much it. You might want to look up La Escalera, the conspiracy of the ladder, a real life planned slave insurrection in Cuba that took place between 1843 and 1844. Delaney's definitely drawing on that, but he's also drawing on all of those old slave insurrections that we talked about in the U.S. back when we were discussing Benito Cereno. There's a long history of slave insurrections. Most were shut down before they could ever really get started. And those that did experience some short-term success, like what we saw in Benito Cereno or Nat Turner's rebellion in 1830s Virginia, not that far from where Delaney's from, the other side of Virginia, but still same general area. Those were successful in the short term, but they were eventually put down, and all organizers and members really were, of course, executed, the ones that survived the rebellion itself. So he's drawing on a lot of this history, and it's history that for a lot of readers even today is not intimately familiar. So that is part of the defamiliarization process that I think we undergo as we read this novel. And of course, the final thing we have to sort of acknowledge is the book is pretty much unfinished. I mean, we never really get a resolution. We never really find out exactly what happens with this slave insurrection that Henry and his associates are planning in Cuba. So we just sort of have to use our imagination. I mean, we sort of have to decide what we think would be most likely to happen next. But a lot of critics, I think McGann makes this point, the character of Gopher Gandelier, who we meet in part 2, a lot of critics think that he represents kind of the doomed aspect of a lot of these slave insurrections. And again, I don't know that we can say definitively that this is what Delaney is saying, but there's a good theory behind this that, Gopher is a little bit overly emotional, perhaps kind of hasty in his machinations, and the plan that is likely to be created by insurrectionists like him, I think some say is the message, that kind of plan is maybe less likely to succeed. It's going to be not as well conceived and not as well organized, and it just has less of a chance to be pulled off. Again, I don't know if that's necessarily there in the text. I think we can see the character of Gopher perhaps representing some of those character traits and ideas, but yeah, it's really kind of up to us to decide sort of what we think would be likely to happen next. Again, if we're thinking of this as just a sort of dramatic or slightly fictionalized rendition of the real Cuban slave insurrection that happened in the 1840s, well, that was put down. And so that might give us some answers. But we can also think that maybe he's departing from that reality a little bit and at least presenting other possibilities. But it's hard to know. There's a fragmented sort of quality here that McGann talks about that is rather frustrating, I think, for readers. But that's the final frustration that we have to cope with. So again, hopefully you guys will sort of take a little bit of a broader view than maybe our initial instinct would dictate, and kind of like I said, push beyond the sort of evaluation that I think we often conduct when we're reading lit. It's a very natural and a very normal and good, first way to kind of engage with the text, to evaluate it, to decide, do I like it or not? Do I think it's good or not? And you're all, of course, very capable and very articulate when it comes to doing that. But there is a time where we have to get beyond that. If we want to conduct analysis, or if we really kind of want to get to the larger meanings and purposes of the text, we kind of have to push beyond the evaluative and say, yeah, I don't like it, but I understand how it works. I understand what it's doing. And I understand, in the case of Blake, these rhetorical functions that we've continued to return to. So, all right, that's enough. We'll move on. And I know we're a little crunched for time here. So when I give you material on Blake, on the final, I'll try to skew a little bit more towards part 1. but we're also going to need to have the book finished in order to really just sort of talk about it in any kind of comprehensive, complete way. So do your best to finish before the semester ends. And my way of helping you, my small way of helping you in that endeavor, is to keep the reading load very light here in week 15. So all we're doing, the only new thing that we're doing in week 15 is Circumstance by Harriet Spofford. And I want to spend some time on this. It's the last thing we're going to read, and in terms of our historical timeline, we're actually a little bit overextended. This was published, I think, in 1863. So we are in the midst of the Civil War now. The subtitle of Unit 4 for us was the eve of the Civil War. Well, by the time we get to Circumstance, we are in the Civil War. Night has passed, and we are in it. So this is where we stop in terms of our chronology. And Spofford's an interesting author. Like a lot, we kind of have a nice split, I hope, in this class between the sort of classic canonical authors that we all knew even before we read them. Like we knew Poe, we knew who Melville was, we knew who Hawthorne was. We probably knew who Washington Irving was, although that might have been a bit more vague. But we've also, I hope, discovered some new authors over the course of this class. Some authors that were popular in the late 18th century or in the 19th century, but for various reasons, somewhat political, the creation of the American literary canon, a lot of this stuff got left out when the canon was being created, like we've said, around the middle of the 20th century. So Spofford is another example of one of these authors that was popular in her time, more popular than a lot of the male members of the traditional literary canon, but she kind of faded from view a little bit later on, was initially excluded from a lot of anthologies or a lot of American Lit survey classes, but then in the 1980s, she was sort of rehabilitated by a well-known American Lit scholar named Alfred Bendixson, who used to teach at Princeton, I think. It doesn't matter. He's somewhere else now. But he was sort of a big champion of Spofford back in the 80s, and he helped to bring her back into the consciousness of lit scholars, professors, and advanced lit students. So in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, when she was writing, she was pretty popular, and she did a lot of different stuff. She wrote novels, she wrote short stories, a little bit of poetry. She wrote a lot of children's fiction. I believe Lydia Maria Child did too, or maybe I'm thinking of Sedgwick. But she wrote children's lit. She did sort of more essay style stuff, kind of outside of the literary realm. So she was prolific, worked in a lot of different genres, and had a very long writing career. It's kind of a mean statement that a lot of lit scholars will say about certain writers, that they outlived their relevance, they outlived their popularity, and that's true of Spofford. But it's true of a lot of authors that we've looked at. I mean, Melville really outlived people's awareness of his existence. Forget about relevance. People didn't even know who the hell Melville was by the time he died. He lived to be a pretty old man, and Spofford also, I think, lived a long time. She kind of faded from popular consciousness by the end of the 19th century. And then 40, 50 years later, when the canon's getting put together, she is kind of left out. Bendixson brings her back. And she's often classified as kind of a romantic writer. Again, not like modern day rom-coms, but, romance as a genre, as a sort of type of literature, featuring exotic settings, improbable events, an emphasis on feelings and emotion. So sometimes the line between romance and sentimental fiction kind of get blurred, because both are really interested in emotions, evoking very specific emotional responses from readers. So her work is often classified in that vein. And we're not going to read her later work because it falls outside of our purview. She was writing it in the late 19th century. She was still alive. But later in her career, she was writing what we often refer to now as like local color. Which became a really important genre in the late 19th century. Regionalism and local color. I'm pretty sure Nick's going to talk to you guys about that in 451 Part 2. So I won't get into it now, but she's kind of a pioneer in that field because she wrote some stories set in small kind of New England towns, rural areas. Can't remember. I think she's from Maine originally. I know Circumstance is set in Maine, but she's definitely a New Englander through and through. And she's kind of helping to set the template for a genre that would become very popular a little bit later. We're not really seeing that development, but we've talked a little bit about regionalism just kind of like as an idea when we were reading Irving. When we read Hawthorne, even like we were talking about how some of these early American writers who were really focused on creating a national literature, like Hawthorne, Emerson was into that, Sims, who we read briefly, The Last Wager. All these guys were kind of into regional literature. They didn't always really have a term for it. I mean, they had the term regional, but they didn't necessarily call it regionalism or local color. Those became more established terms, again, after the Civil War. But even a lot of this earlier stuff that we read, we definitely see how a lot of American writers understood that to create uniquely national literature, we needed to capture unique regions of the U.S. Places that weren't like anywhere else in the world, really. Like old Dutch New York or like old Puritan New England. In the case of Hawthorne, Sims and some of those Southwestern humorists back in the 1840s, they were doing the same stuff. They were capturing the frontier South and the colorful characters that lived there. That was a very, the subject matter, the themes, the humor at work in something like Hooper and Simon Suggs, that was unique to a particular region, a particular time, a particular place, a particular American or U.S. region. So it's not like the idea didn't already exist, but it became kind of codified and formalized in the later 19th century. So, yeah, anyway, Spofford's a part of that, but we're not really going to see that. Although Circumstance, it's very much kind of a product of New England in certain ways. This is a story a little bit about the frontier. It's about a frontier area in Maine where there are white settlers, but there's still Native Americans in very close proximity, and we're still kind of in the early stages of the establishment of U.S. society, right? We talked about this with earlier texts. We saw this with Edgar Huntley. We saw this a little bit with Brackenridge even, right? It takes time to really build a complete society. First, you have kind of isolated settlers, like we saw in Huntley, right? All these farmers who kind of live near each other, and they know each other, and they occasionally join together to go and fight the Native Americans, but they're kind of isolated. Like, they all live pretty far apart because they all own a lot of property that they, of course, stole from the local Delaware Indians. So, you are kind of close to other settlers, but a lot of the staples of what we would consider like civic society, civil society, like schools or like branches of government or like law enforcement, like a lot of that stuff didn't really exist in frontier communities, at least not for several decades. Until more people could move there, more people could, build and kind of pool resources. So in the early stages of frontier settlement, there's a lot of danger. There's a lot of fear. And we saw that with Huntley, and I think we're going to see it again here with Circumstance. So this story kind of operates on two different levels, and I want us to be aware of both. On the surface level, it's kind of a straightforward horror story, really. We have a woman literally captured by a panther, and she is sort of held hostage in a tree by a very large predatory cat. On the most literal sort of surface level, that's what the story is about, right? And her various strategies for surviving and trying to extricate herself from this very difficult situation. So she is seized and borne aloft. I love that phrase, seized and borne aloft into a big tree by this large panther. So while in the grasp of the panther, she comes to the realization that if she sings, she's able to kind of pacify the panther. And yes, this is a highly improbable turn of events, but remember how readers would have interpreted it back in the 1860s. Oh, this is kind of a work of romance. And we even talked about this a little bit with Hawthorne. You know, Hawthorne considered himself to be a romancer, and he makes a distinction between super realistic novels and romance. He says romance can be kind of out there. Romance can have supernatural stuff. Romance is going to have improbable events. It's fun. That's what I like. And so that's kind of how Circumstance would have been viewed. You know, Spofford's kind of thought of as a romantic writer. So this wouldn't have been terribly shocking to readers. They would have said, okay, it's an improbable event. We have some other ones over the course of this story, so it kind of fits the genre. But yeah, she begins to sing to the cat in order to prevent the cat from eating her. But there's a really interesting progression that occurs. So on the more sort of figurative, more interesting level, a lot of critics, and Ben Dixon in particular, I'm just going to basically rip off his interpretation because it's better than anything I'm going to come up with. Ben Dixon reads the whole story as basically the story of women being imprisoned, like women being pretty much enclosed within these social and cultural rules and roles, very similar to what we were talking about with the Coquette. But Ben Dixon argues that Spofford's more explicit about it. Like in the Coquette, maybe it's there, but we can also read it as kind of a straightforward seduction tale where we're supposed to just think Eliza is making a lot of mistakes and we need to learn from her mistakes. Like we can read it that way. But Ben Dixon's saying, look, you know, this story is more clear if you follow what happens with the panther. He says this story is clearly making the point that this woman is captured. She is confined. Not, I mean, yeah, on a literal level by the panther, but on a more important figurative level by society, by her husband, who doesn't mean her any harm, but we're going to see how he actually kind of has a negative impact in many ways. Her family kind of has a negative impact on her in this story, and that's kind of a weird thing to see in a popular from a popular writer in the 1860s. So we're going to walk through Ben Dixon's interpretation in a moment, but first let's just kind of cover the basic setup here and remind ourselves that, you know, as she's walking back, you know, from this friend's house, again, this is a somebody she's friendly with, somebody she knows, but they live like a mile away. I mean, they live far away from her own home, right? So again, this is a frontier environment. This is a frontier settlement. And that was going to have certain immediate associations that would be brought to mind for a lot of readers at the time, right? We would have sort of a visceral fear of the kind of environment that she's in, walking alone through the woods, kind of late in the day as daylight is beginning to decline. Or maybe it's already dark. I can't remember. It might already be dark when she starts on her journey. I think she stays longer than she intends as she's, you know, doctoring some neighbor. But this is scary, right? Because she's out in the woods, she's by herself, and this is a frontier district. So a lot of readers would have immediately understood that she's largely afraid of two things here. And I think this is made pretty clear in the text. She's afraid of Native Americans, for one, and then she's afraid of large predatory animals like a panther or a bear, you know, something that could, you know, grab her and kill her out in the woods. So again, this is, you know, we need to understand this is kind of a part of her everyday reality, or for anybody who lives in a frontier district, those would be sort of two constant fears that you would be ambushed or taken hostage perhaps by Native Americans, or that you would be mauled by a big cat or a bear. And I guess like logically we all understand that, but I just think as modern readers, we have to kind of remind ourselves that those were legitimate fears, and this story is very much tapping into the fear of those animals. A fear that we don't really experience a whole lot. Maybe some of us do. I know some of us probably live in rural areas. I've lived my whole life in towns and cities and suburbs. I'm not from like a big city, but I'm from a suburban community, you know, where wild animals weren't really a big threat to our safety. So it's hard for me to relate. I think it's hard for a lot of modern people to relate to what it must have been like to live in constant fear of large animals. But that's very much the world that she inhabits. So yeah, I think it's on, I have a different edition, never mind. I just linked you guys to the entire collection of Spofford's, The Amber Gods. This is a short story collection. All we are reading is circumstance. But if you like her style, certainly feel free to read some of the other stories in the collection. She's really good. Oh yeah, and I actually did just want to read you guys a little bit from Ben Dixon's intro. This is my edition of The Amber Gods. Because again, I think we can, in terms of her style, we'll get into his interpretation of her singing, because that's really the crux of the story. But I think if we're considering her style and sort of her way with language, we can definitely compare her in a lot of ways to some of the previous authors that we read. She kind of belongs in a general sense to that sort of same American Renaissance generation. And Ben Dixon wants to draw some of those parallels. So this is just part of his critical intro to a new edition of The Amber Gods. He says, like Poe, Hawthorne, and Melville, Spofford expects readers to accept extravagant plots, exotic settings, extraordinary characters, and unusual situations. But also, this is more important because we've already covered the rest of it, also a prose style that rejects the plain simplicity of ordinary speech in favor of an elaborately wrought literary language and a process of symbolism in which the natural merges with the supernatural. So I think he's very right about that. Her sort of style of literary language does remind me of Hawthorne. Her heavy investment in symbolism, sort of figurative meaning, but also the sort of finely tuned, elaborate, complex nature of a lot of her sentences. A little similar to the styles of Hawthorne, maybe even Melville. And like them, she can be challenging to readers, at least modern readers, but probably all readers, because you often have to read between the lines a little bit. She also wrote detective fiction. That's kind of fun. Ben Dixon talks about one of her well-known short stories called In the Cellar, which is an early example of American detective fiction. And he makes the case that Poe and Spofford are kind of working at around the same time to really create the American detective fiction genre, and In the Cellar is really good. I wish we could have read that one, but it's in the same collection. So if you're interested, you can check it out. It's in The Amber Gods. But anyway, so I think he's right about that. And if we're thinking about the symbolic level that this book that this story operates on, again, that's his reading. It doesn't necessarily, his reading is on the symbolic level. This is a story about social confines for women. So you don't necessarily have to read it that way. Of course, we're all aware that women did not have an equal role in society during the 1860s. You don't need me to explain that to you. But if you don't think that's really what Spofford is getting at here, that's fine. I think part of one of the best parts of this story, I think, is that it can operate on both of those levels. If we just want to read it as a straight horror story that's just kind of exciting, we can do that. But then we can also look at it on that deeper symbolic level if we want to. So, oh man, I thought I had this page written down. I wanted to share with you, because Ben Dixon talks about this as well, and we don't have to talk about it a lot, but one of somebody who read Spofford and liked her was Emily Dickinson. And Dickinson has this great quote, and I wish I had labeled it so I could find it in the intro. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it now. It was about Dickinson's own experience reading Circumstance. Oh, this is very frustrating for me, and I'm sure it is for you. I'm sorry. I might have it written down. I have some stuff on Dickinson that we're actually not getting to. And I might have written it there. Well, it doesn't matter. I can try to remember well enough to paraphrase it. She says that she read Circumstance and she tried to forget it, but it followed her in the dark. That was the quote from Dickinson. And she also said that Circumstance was one of the only things that she had ever read that when reading it, she thought that she didn't think she could have written it herself, basically, is my paraphrase. It's one of the few texts that she read that she didn't think she could have written just as well herself. And it just really is going to stick in my craw that I can't find the Dickinson quote in here. Here it is. The only thing I ever saw in my life that I did not think I could have written myself. That Circumstance, according to Dickinson. And then here's the quote. I read Miss Prescott's Circumstance. I think Prescott was maybe her maiden name. I think Spofford was her married name. I read Miss Prescott's Circumstance, but it followed me in the dark. So I avoided her. So that's just great praise, I think, from another titan of American lit, to think that this story like legitimately frightened Dickinson, and like, you know, kind of maybe even kept her up at night. So she definitely appreciated Spofford, and in particular was really glowing in her assessment of Circumstance. So that suddenly seems less important now that I work so hard to find it. So let's just get back to what Ben Dixon was talking about as far as the progression that occurs over the course of Circumstance. And I am going to borrow his interpretation here. So again, he claims that this is all a journey of self-discovery for our protagonist. And this journey is kind of illustrated or explained by the songs that she sings. So he breaks this down. There are 3 different song styles on display here. And I think this is really worth looking into. So she starts out, when she first starts to sing to the Panther, she starts out with what's described as a cradle song in the text. That's kind of an old-fashioned phrase. I think nowadays we would just call it a lullaby. Would be a more modern term, I guess. But it's a children's song, right? It's the type of song that she would sing to her baby back at home. So, okay, that makes sense, right? And Ben Dixon says this is a traditionally feminine song, because, of course, women would have been expected during this time period to do most of the child rearing. So it would be women, it would be mothers, and maybe like older sisters, or nannies who would hum lullabies to small children to get them to go to sleep, right? That's a typically feminine role, and these are songs typically sung by women. Okay, so that makes sense. But then notice what's happening on the more literal level of the story. As she starts to sing about that stuff, it makes her think about home. It makes her think about her own baby and her husband. She wants to return to them, obviously. She does not want to be devoured by the panther. So she gets distracted, in other words. And in the text, she stops singing because she's thinking about home. So as a result, the panther gets a little bit antsy and starts to gnaw on her arm. Once again, threatening the possibility of eventually eating her. So she stops with that initial song style. And Ben Dixon says she realizes at this point in this situation that thinking about her family is actually dangerous because it's going to distract her. It's going to get her mind away from what she needs to be focusing on right now, which is how do I keep this panther happy? How do I kind of lull this panther into a pacified state where he is no longer interested in eating me? So she adopts a different style of song, right? She begins to sing again. But now she starts to sing a different style of music, a wild sea song. That's how it's described in the text. Something like a sailor might sing during a voyage at sea. So Ben Dixon sees this as the beginning of her shifting to what we would think of as a more masculine type of song. The songs that would have been sung by sailors or laborers, perhaps, more typical male occupations. And he thinks that it's significant that we get several examples of the types of songs that she's performing. She really is performing for this panther. So she does sea shanties, reels, jigs, and later she does what's called wild, melancholy, forsaken songs. Weeping, wailing tunes. These are the direct quotes. Weeping, wailing tunes. Rude, mournful ballads that Shakespeare heard the vagrants sing. Very interesting change to observe. Now, again, we understand that you don't have to be a man to sing those songs. I mean, obviously not, because she's singing them and she knows them, so she's heard them. But again, the occupations that would have usually been associated with these kinds of songs would be male back then, right? They would be masculine. These songs are kind of coded as masculine. These are what men would have been doing at sort of homosocial gatherings. So if you remember what we were talking about with, Whitman and his interest in like homosocial groups of men, like, working on the railroad or working on canals or lumber camps, places where it was just men. It was men working together, living together, drinking in excess together, fighting, whatever, sometimes having romantic relationships. So that's a little bit of what we would associate with some of these songs, right? A bunch of drunk guys after a hard day at work, somebody's going to bust out a fiddle and do a little rude song, a kind of ballad from long ago that might be a little raunchy or about love, mostly about sex, probably. But it'd be something that would be fun, festive, kind of active, right? And in the case of those old mournful ballads, the stuff that Shakespeare heard back in Elizabethan England, we're getting tapped into this big, long history, right? This sort of, this like larger significance that kind of surpasses what would have usually been associated with feminine art or feminine music, which would have usually been thought of as kind of more trivial or more centered around children, right? Whereas these traditionally masculine songs, they have a longer, richer history. They're going to be performed by all kinds of different men throughout time. And they kind of live on in a lot of these homosocial environments. And yeah, women would have heard those songs, that they might have been performed at larger community gatherings. And some women might have danced to those songs. But depending on where you lived, depending on how socially conservative your community was, especially if you were a very religious person, it probably wouldn't have been super acceptable for a woman to dance to a reel or a jig, but a man probably could, right? That would be okay for most men to do, but again, it was kind of coded as more masculine, a more masculine type of music. But when she starts to sing those songs, once again, she's able to pacify the panther. But then she transitions to a third and final style of music, which Ben Dixon, well, I think this is actually from Spofford. It's described as grand and sweet Methodist hymns. So now our protagonist is kind of going back to her religious teachings. She's going back to her religious background, and she's singing stuff that she would have sung in church, that she would have been surrounded by probably from an early age in this kind of religious community. And of course, a lot of Americans at this time would have had a pretty close allegiance to their local church, whatever denomination they were. So this transports her into a different state of mind, some sort of revelry. It almost seems like a vision that she begins to have, or some kind of religious experience, right? But again, this might not be the first time she's had a vision. I kind of forgot to mention this, but at the very beginning of the story, remember that she sees that strange white sheet as she's walking. And that's kind of important. The strange winding sheet that appears before her as she begins on her journey. It's cold, it's white, it's sort of ghastly. And she also hears something. So like, what is that? Is that a vision? Is that a premonition? Is it some kind of an omen? But it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with like frontier life. A lot of weird stuff happens on the frontier. Like that's a point Ben Dixon makes. He says, this is a hardy frontier woman. She's used to living this way. There's constant danger. There's constant fear, but she's kind of accustomed to it. So it's not just wild animals. It's also just that there's a lot of unusual events that might transpire out on the frontier where there's not a lot of people around. And we're in these primeval forests. Weird stuff's going on. It doesn't seem to faze her too much, that first vision that she has. And now here with the Methodist hymns, she's having another vision. It's almost like a divine rapture is how I think it's described at one point in the text. So that seems to be brought on by this specifically religious music that she begins to perform. So that's important too, because, and again, just also remember, if we're thinking about the supernatural or the weird, that's also characteristic, like we said, of the romance. So she's good on both counts. The frontier justifies the weird stuff, and the genre that she's working in justifies improbable events and the possible presence of supernatural forces or spiritual forces, which might be working here as well. And she seems to gain some kind of strength and resolve from these Methodist hymns, from this vision that she's having. But then notice what happens next. Her husband shows up to save her. And at that point, I want you to notice that two things happen simultaneously. Two significant things happen. First, this vision of God's peace that she's been enjoying goes away. Now, again, there's a practical reason for this. She snapped out of it by the presence of her husband and this sudden, the action that begins to transpire at that point as he tries to kill the panther. But also, according to Ben Dixon, this has a more important sort of symbolic or figurative meaning. Right? Her vision of God's peace is very much ruined or taken away by the presence of her husband. And then, perhaps even more importantly, at the same time, she literally loses her voice because she's been singing all night. So again, we can see the practical explanation for this. Yeah, of course you're going to lose your voice eventually if you've been singing to this panther all night long. But also, we got to see the symbolic importance of that, or the figurative importance of that, right? She loses her voice. That has a meaning that goes beyond just, my throat hurts, So again, Ben Dixon reads this as, all of this as a series of symbolic representations of the surprisingly negative effect that her family has on her. Because I think her husband even doesn't he have the baby? He's like carrying the baby. He's got the gun. So like her whole family unit is there right? And they're kind of messing things up for her. Unintentionally, of course, but nevertheless, her religious vision ends and she loses her voice. She was kind of doing okay without them, without her husband and child. She figured out an effective strategy for keeping the panther pacified. Now, if we're being very literal minded, we could probably say eventually, especially if she runs out of voice, if she can't sing forever, eventually the panther is probably going to eat her or just kill her for sport, because that's kind of what cats do. Domestic cats are no different. So yeah, probably. But she almost seemed to kind of be at peace with that. Again, the religious vision might give her hope for what lies on the other side of her inevitable demise in the grasp of the panther. So even if she is destined to eventually die in that tree, she seems to arrive at some kind of peace. And Ben Dixon says equally important is she discovers agency. She discovers her own voice. She can sing masculine songs. She doesn't have to just stick with lullabies. She doesn't just have to stick with the traditional feminine coded cradle songs that mothers would have been expected to know. She can do more. She has a voice that goes beyond that. She has abilities that go beyond that. She can stay alive through her mastery of certain masculine forms, we might say, I think Ben Dixon says, and that just shows her potential, or the fact that if freed from certain social confines, we wouldn't have to label things perhaps feminine or masculine, because anybody could do anything. But all of that changes when her husband shows up. And Ben Dixon talks about this phrase that we hear near the end. She had learned the secret of sound at last. She had learned the secret of sound. So again, on a literal level, maybe that just means what she's figured out about the singing and how that's keeping her alive. But it seems bigger than that. It seems to represent more than that. She's unlocked some kind of secret. And it seems like she's gained access to some kind of new knowledge, some kind of new perspective, whether it's strictly gender-based or whether it's spiritual or religious in nature. You'll have to decide. But definitely some important changes are occurring within her, it seems like. And she's able to kind of cope with this terrifying situation, and she's acquiring a power that's bigger than her. It's bigger than her family. Maybe one way to think of it is it's bigger than motherhood. It's bigger than being a wife. It's bigger than fulfilling all of those typical feminine functions. Not that those aren't important. I mean, obviously they are to a great many people. But again, she's moving beyond those cradle songs, right? She's going into other kinds of music, and she's accomplishing other things. And she does all of this alone. Very important. She does all of it alone. She doesn't really need anybody to help her to achieve these things. She does them. She figures it out. She sings the songs, and she stays alive. But then her husband shows up. She loses her vision of God. She loses her voice. And then he rescues her in a very conventional sense. He kills the panther, and he takes her back to their log cabin, only for them to discover that the log cabin has been burned to the ground by a marauding party of Native Americans. So there's that other frontier fear that we mentioned earlier. It's wild animals and it's Native Americans first and foremost. So they kind of bookend this story. First, the wild animals, and then the Native Americans burn down their home. Which would not have been a terribly unusual occurrence on a frontier within a frontier settlement. But in some ways, this whole experience with her and the panther, and the fact that it draws her husband and child out of the house during the night, it keeps them all alive. Think about it. Her actions really save her husband in certain respects. Now, yeah, she doesn't necessarily choose to be attacked by the panther, but the fact that she is attacked by the panther and the fact that she stays alive as long as she does, that helps to ultimately, at least indirectly, it helps to save her husband and her baby. So that's another interesting thing, to consider. So that's pretty much it. The final point I'll give you from Ben Dixon, well, he compares this to The Awakening by Kate Chopin. A lot of you probably had to read that like in high school or some survey class by now. Chopin's another important American author from the very late 19th century and very early 20th. So not in our time period, but a lot of you might be aware of The Awakening and some of her other fiction, which kind of explores the conflicts and the confines that affect women living in the U.S. during that time. But also, a lot of people read Chopin's work to often be very much about women artists, even though not all of her characters are necessarily artists, but a lot of her themes and sort of, symbolic material we often think sort of represents the specific and even bigger challenges of being a female artist during this time period and being very confined by these restrictive social roles. So that might be a comparison that you could run with. You could probably find other modern texts that might remind us a little bit more of Circumstance. I mean, The Awakening is not exactly modern, but it's more modern than our stuff. But you could find truly contemporary stuff to also perhaps compare to it. And also, the end is interesting. When they return to their burned down, village, we get a final allusion with an A from Spofford, this time to Paradise Lost and Adam and Eve. So what do we think that means within the larger context of this text and some of the ideas and themes that we just talked about? So that's all I have for Circumstance. I hope you guys like that one. I just think it's really well done. It's a thriller, but it's got so much more going on. So like I said, we can appreciate it on both of those two levels. Okay, so before I sign off, let's just talk very briefly about the final exam. Mostly, I just want to encourage you guys to reach out to me if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, email me. We can just talk through email, or I can set up a video conference, whatever you'd like. Don't stress too much about the exam. It's not designed to be incredibly difficult, and it's not designed to be incredibly time-consuming. So I really want you guys to be able to complete it in a single sitting. And really, I envision it taking around 2 hours, maybe an hour and a half. I mean, everybody works at different speeds, obviously, but on average, it takes most students between an hour and a half and 2 hours, and you really shouldn't devote that much more time to it. I want you to devote more of your time to the final paper, because obviously the final paper is worth more in terms of points, and it just matters more to me. The exam is just there to make sure that we've read. The paper is really us engaging in the work of our field, right? This is literary scholarship that I'm asking you guys to do. I want you to perform high-level literary analysis using research, but primarily using your own readings and your own ideas. And I know that's hard and it's going to take a long time, but I've already seen from our critical responses, I've seen that we're all capable of doing it. So it's just a question of choosing your text. You can use multiple texts, but make sure you have strong connections binding them together. And you need to find that entry point, that specific item or idea that you're interested in, that you want to talk about. That's how you make your argument original. And look, I get it. If you're writing about Whitman or Hawthorne or even someone like Phyllis Wheatley, a lot of work has already been done on them. A lot of interpretations have already been made. So you're going to feel a little bit overwhelmed, perhaps, as you get moving on research. But there's always a way to make an original argument. Now, just speaking from experience, it is a little bit easier sometimes to make an original argument about a text that's been written about less often, like Blake, or like some, maybe even Circumstance, although Ben Dixon's kind of covered it. But, modern chivalry, some of the poems that we looked at, maybe some of the Native American folklore, the trickster tales that we read. Not to say that there hasn't been a lot of stuff done about that, but maybe a little bit less than what we're going to find with Poe, with Hawthorne, with Melville. Because, they've been done a lot, but there's always new things to say. Because everybody reads differently and everybody has their own ideas. So never feel like you can't make an original argument about a really popular author or text, but just, make sure it's an argument that you feel like you can sustain for an extended period of time. Make sure it's something that you're really interested in and kind of passionate about. We can start with the evaluation, like pick your favorite stuff. Pick the text that you're most interested in, that you enjoyed the most, that you thought was the richest, that had the most possibilities when it comes to reading and understanding. That's a good way to get started, as informal as it sounds. Just pick your faves. But then the next step is to say, all right, well, what am I going to say about it? What can I offer? And I'm talking about the paper. I know I told you I would talk about the exam, but I'm already back on the paper. Just focus on what you want to say. What is your reading? What is your original interpretation? Doesn't matter if it's different from mine. Doesn't matter if it's different from other people's. It's yours. Start with that. And if you have a lot to say, maybe you can pursue it. Once you do some research, you'll have a better sense of what other people have said and how you fit into the larger debate. But you should always start with your own ideas and then get into the research. So I'm looking forward to looking at your critical summaries. I'll give you some feedback on your proposals and the critical summaries early in week 15. But I'm not sure how we got into the paper, but I'm giving you all of these final tips. Just don't be overwhelmed. We can always say original stuff, but with the paper, you do need to give yourself time. I think that was my original point. You need to give yourself a lot of time to put together all that I'm asking for. You need to do some research. I recommend putting together an informal outline before you start writing. Then you need to create a rough draft. I can help you with a rough draft if you send it my way. And then you revise and you turn it into a polished final draft. It's going to be a process. So give yourself plenty of time to work on the final paper. And when it comes to the final exam, try to polish that off relatively quickly. Don't obsess. Don't worry. It might not be perfect, but if you've read everything, or if you've read almost everything, you're going to do fine. The only people who have a really tough time with my exams are the people who don't read. And if you didn't read, you will be exposed. But if you've watched me for this long, I'm assuming that you've read and you'll be fine on the exam. But check out my study guide. I've already posted it. And also check out my sample exam. It's not from this class. It's from a 416 class. That's a different literature class, but the basic format of the exam is the same as what you'll see. So the identification section, the short answer section, and then the short essay section. It's all going to be the same, but obviously the questions are going to be different because we were reading different stuff in 416. So just get familiar with my format, and that will help you to prepare. Because for the ID section, I want the author name, at least the last name. I want the title of the text, and I want the year of publication. Now, if you're 1 year off or 2 years off, that's not really a big deal, but you need to make sure you have that info. And I provided all of that info in my study guide. So one thing that you should remember with my exam, this is very old school, but you can always use a note card of this size for your notes. Because I know it's hard to commit everything to memory. And obviously the exam is closed book. I don't want you going online. You're just working with your pre-existing knowledge. But you can also use a note card, fill it up front and back with anything that you just don't think you'll be able to remember. And I took a lot of these literature exams for like half of my life, and I would often focus on the IDs, at least on one side of the index card. I would write down author names, titles, years of publication, because we forget that stuff if we're not careful. So jot some of that stuff down, and then also jot down some big, larger kind of ideas or concepts that I'm mentioning in the study guide, stuff that's going to come up in the short answers, and it's also stuff that you can talk about in the essay, the short essay that you write as the final part of the exam. So just jot some things down that might not fit inside your heads, and you can use that note card, but nothing else. So the final thing I'll say, how are we going to take the exam? Well, the way that we're supposed to do it, according to the GBC kind of rules and regulations, this is supposed to be a proctored exam. But I'm a little bit loose in my interpretation of that expression. So I basically want you guys to do one of two things. You can either use a lockdown browser, and I know a lot of you have some experience with that from previous classes. You can use a lockdown browser on your home computer, and you can just take the exam at home, on your personal device. I've opened the exam here at the beginning of week 15. I think I told you a different date, but I went ahead and just did it here at the beginning of week 15. So you'll notice it's just a Word doc with all of my questions. You open up that Word doc, and then you can download it, save it. You can either put your answers directly into that doc, or you can create a new doc with your answers, and you can just submit that file when you are finished. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward, but if you can use the lockdown browser, I'll be happy, because then I know that you can't go online. And look, I trust you guys. I mean, I hope we're not offended. I don't think any of us would plagiarize, but in a class of 28 or 29, there often will be one or two, who do. So I just have to guard against it. And again, this is very much kind of school policy stuff. It's not really my own personal preferences and choices. But we just have to, provide safeguards so we can trust the results. So the lockdown browser's fine. I provided a link that we can use. Some of us might already have one installed. Let me know if you have questions. The other option is to go to a public location, like a public library or a testing center, or in some cases another institution of higher learning. I know some of you live closer to other colleges than you do to any GBC facility. So in some cases, these other locations, they might let you come in and take the exam there. And even if you don't have anybody standing over your shoulder the whole time, as long as there's some kind of supervision in this public venue, I'm pretty comfortable with anybody taking the exam there. As long as, you're able to do that. You might need to make an appointment. But I did say previously, if you're going to take it at a public location, it would be great if you could just send me a quick email with the address and maybe some contact info, either a phone number or email, just in case, and I rarely do, but just in case I have to get in touch with whoever works there. It would be great if I had that info. You can just put it into an email. You don't even have to address me. You can just cut and paste the contact info and the address and just send me the email, or we can talk about it at some other point if we're having a conference or if we're talking about something else via email, whatever you want. And ask me questions, reach out. I'm happy to look at drafts. I'm happy to answer kind of practical questions about the exam, like where you can take it. I can't really help you with the exam, obviously, but I'll answer questions about my study guide. Look at my study guide this week. And if you have questions about it, talk to me. After this week, it's kind of radio silence, right? No more lectures, no more official anything, right? No more modules, but you can always talk to me through email and the phone if needed. So don't hesitate. I'm here to help. Good luck. And I've really enjoyed this semester. You guys have been you've been great. I've enjoyed the discussions. I've enjoyed looking at your work. You guys have done a really nice job throughout the semester. I know I've asked a lot of you. And you've met the challenge, so you should feel good about that. Well, so far, we're not sure what's going to happen, but I'm confident that everybody's going to be fine. Everybody who puts in the work will be fine. And if you need help, I'm always here. So, great semester. I've had fun. Have a great Christmas break, and I hope to talk to you again one day. All right, bye.